Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us at our Librarians World Series program. My name is Mervyn Ang from the National Library, and I will be your MC this evening. While long-running newspapers such as the Straits Times and the Singapore Free Press remain popular sources for historical research on Singapore, publications by English literate Asians in colonial Singapore have received considerably less attention. Senior Librarian Gracie Lee will introduce some of these lesser-known titles from the National Library's collection. So we're bringing them digitally to you this evening. So newspapers such as the Malaya Tribune, the Straits Eurasian Advocate, the Straits Chinese Herald, and the Japanese-owned Singapore Herald were established to give voice to the worldviews, concerns, and interests of the communities they represent. Gracie is a senior librarian with the National Library Singapore. She works with the rare materials collections, and her research areas are in Singapore's publishing history and the Japanese occupation. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I shall now hand over the time to Gracie. Gracie, over to you.
Welcome everybody. Tonight I'll be talking a little bit about the English language newspapers in multi-ethnic colonial Singapore. So this will take place from 1824 all the way to 1959. So historical newspapers are very popularly used resources in the library's collection. So more often than not, our patrons will consult like the Straits Times and the Singapore Free Press because these are the two longest running newspapers in Singapore. As you can see from this slide, there are actually quite a number of English newspapers that were published during this colonial period. So I've taken these titles from Patricia Lin's Union list and compared it with our collection. So this is just an estimate. Things like variant titles or overseas titles, I've counted them as one. So despite the English reading population being rather small, can see here in 1921, the census recorded only about 5.7% of the population, or maybe close to 20,000 residents as having some form of literacy in English. So these are self-declared as being able to read and write in English. So I felt that these newspapers sort of merit these defunct and so-called extinct, expired papers merit further study because I myself didn't know much about it. So that's why I decided to embark on this and to just focus on the newspapers that were established by the Anglophone Asians. And we'll find that there's actually SPH newspapers are relatively well documented as part of their corporate history, as well as the early pioneering papers. But these little short-run papers, the information is scattered everywhere, and sometimes there may even be errors that are written. There are errors when people write about their history. So as far as possible, I hope to address some of these today. This will be the basic outline. We'll just talk a bit about the beginnings of newspaper publishing in Singapore because we need some context. And then I'll jump straight into the main topic for tonight. And then we just end off with some recent additions and discoveries in our newspaper collection. And then to introduce also some of the digitized content that we are putting onto our online portal. And last but not least, also to share some of these other digitized newspaper content which are not in our collection. Okay, so I think most people know that our first newspaper is actually the Singapore Chronicle. It began in 1st Jan 1824, but today we only have issues starting from 1827. So this was actually founded by Francis Bernard, who was the son-in-law of William Farquhar, and he was also in charge of the police. So this newspaper application received a lot of endorsement from John Crawford because he believed that Singapore needed a mercantile paper to facilitate trade, and it will help Singapore's growth as a colony. So this first newspaper was very commercial in nature. It will have things like import-export, a lot of advertising, and it also functioned as a semi-gazette. Now you can see there's a red arrow that I've put there. So it actually mentions that public notifications appearing in this newspaper and signed by the authority is considered as official news. Yeah. So Bernard wasn't an editor for very long. Probably only about 3 issues, and then Crawford took over, and he basically ran the whole newspaper for a long time. And so there wasn't really much issues with the government. There was something called a gagging act at that moment to sort of censor newspapers because they didn't want news that was kind of negative about the East India Company and things like that. So under Crawford's control, there wasn't really an issue. So after that, we have our second newspaper, which is the Singapore Free Press. As the name sort of connotes, it means free. So it was backed by men of standing and influence. We can see here there's Napier, Coleman, and Bolstead. So Napier was the first, Singapore's first lawyer, and Coleman was the leading architect and superintendent of the public works, and Bolstead, a prominent merchant. So they publish again news about commercial in nature, about trade, and about the natural history of Singapore, import, export, things like that. So it was known to be a very somber and moderate kind of newspaper. And but it died in 1869, but was revived again. So this is actually a new series in 1884 by Buckley. So you can see a picture of him here. So it carried on until it was kind of overcome by the competition, which is the Straits Times, which came out morning edition, and then it finally merged and then died in 1962. So now we come to, of course, a well-known newspaper that we read. I still subscribe to it in the morning. So it's the longest running English paper that we know. So it's started in 1845. So even so, it's such a well-known newspaper. The beginnings are actually not very clear. But those who want to read more about it, you can read this book by C.M. Turnbull. She sort of documented 150 years of the Straits Times history. But in short, one version which most people sort of ascribe to is that the paper was started by 2 Armenians and English journalists. So the Armenian merchant, Martus Thaddeus Apa, he bought a printing press wanting to start a newspaper, but he ran into financial difficulties. So the press was actually purchased by Chadwick Moses, who then hired Woods, a journalist from Bombay, to start the newspaper. So after that, Straits Times sort of ventured into many different type of editions, and they even went into Malaya buying over newspapers. So that's where we are today. So now straight into this newspapers by this Anglophone. So I would like to start with the Eurasian community. Even though the Eurasian community is relatively small, so in 1881 there are about 3,000, almost 3,000 recorded, over 3,000 recorded Eurasians, but they played a very big role in establishing a lot of the early newspapers. They're very involved in it. So one of the first newspapers that I could find is actually the Straits Observer. So it started from 1869, and I put a question mark because not too sure when it ended. So it was published twice a week, and at the time only cost 25 cents a copy. I think it's quite expensive if you think in terms of how much people are earning at that time. Today, I think our newspaper costs like $1.10. Yeah. So there's an origin and new series. The one that the library has is the new series. So it was printed and published by John Francis Hanson, who was a proprietor of this commercial press. So this commercial press was already in existence before Hanson took over. So it was a small printing plant at Raffles Place that offered that kind of printing, lithography, binding services. So Hanson was into this, and he also published other newspapers like the Daily Advertiser and stuff like that, and our annual directory. So who was Hanson? I don't know much about him, but what I'm able to find is that he was actually an owner of a plantation in Alexandria, and he was a member of the Church of Good Shepherd. So he died in 1900, and when he died, his death was actually mourned by the Eurasian community. Yeah. So next paper is also again by the Eurasian community, also related to Hanson. It's called the Straits Intelligence. It's printed again twice a week, and 25 cents again, same as the previous one. And why did they start up this newspaper? It was basically to supply Singapore with a second newspaper, because I think just now, as we have seen, the Singapore Free Press, it sort of ceased in 1869 and then was only later brought back in 1884. So during this time, there's a gap, and Straits Times was the monopoly. So all the news was only coming from one source. So they felt that they needed to have another newspaper to compete with the Straits Times. So according to Makepeace 100 Years of Singapore, it was Hanson's son, John A. Hanson, who came out with the idea of having a newspaper. Because of the fast-growing Chinese population in Singapore, he felt that the Eurasian community was increasingly being isolated. Just to give a sense, there were about 87,000 Chinese in 1881, compared to maybe about the 3,000 Eurasians. So he decided to start the newspaper to forward the interests of the community, and it was published and printed by his father at the Commercial Press. So, but then this 100 years also said he started the newspaper in the 1870s. But as you can see, what we have here is 1882. This is really the earliest, and each of these newspapers are always numbered as Volume 1, Volume 2. So we know he couldn't have started something earlier unless it's a different title. Yeah. So this was a family affair. So why... in the end, the newspaper had to close down because it was sort of sued. Later on, you'll see it's quite common in those days, I think, for people to sue newspapers when they feel the newspaper has said something that is defamatory to them, and then newspapers would close down because they are being sued. Yeah. So let's look at the prospectus. The first issue, when it came out, these newspapers will typically explain why did they start this newspaper. So this one said it was to compete, I think we mentioned, against the Straits Times, to prevent this kind of monopoly, so we could have a platform of different views, and also to supply local news and very good, accurate reports of all these public meetings and events, and to discuss topical issues that Singapore was facing. And you can see over here, it says to adopt a policy that will not advocate the interests of any class, section, or clique, political or otherwise, but will review, comment, and criticize within the province of a newspaper with impartiality and from a public-spirited standpoint. So you're saying that this colony of Singapore is very cosmopolitan, made up of many races and nationalities, and they wanted to represent all these voices. So I think these are early hints that perhaps the Straits Times was not sufficiently representing the voices of certain groups of people in Singapore, be it a particular ethnicity or a class of people. And hence, we will see from here on there were the number of newspapers that will be established to sort of counter this monopoly by the Straits Times. Yeah. Okay, now we come to this weekly newspaper, Straits Eurasian Advocate. So it's a weekly Saturday paper, and this is really the first one that I found that specifically tried to address the issues that the Eurasian community was facing. So it was published in 1888. Again, the 100 Years of Singapore mentioned that it was started by a John Nicholson in 1887, but this is actually the Volume 1, Issue 1. So it couldn't have been published at that period. It would have started in 1888. And according to the newspaper, and also what we saw in what we see in the Government Gazette, is that this person called Henry Arnold Chopard was the person who started this paper and was printed at the Union Press. So it was about 15 cents cheaper than the previous one. There are about 150 copies being printed. So who was this Chopard? He was a managing clerk at Rodick and Davison, which is one of Singapore's largest and oldest law firms. And he was also a member of the Singapore Recreation Club and a management committee member of the Mutual Improvement Society. Okay, so now let's look again. The prospectus would explain why did they set up this newspaper. So we said that Eurasians form a large proportion of the population in the Straits settlements, unlike similar communities in India and Ceylon. There's been no newspaper for them to ventilate their grievances, to talk about their causes. So the community here wasn't just looking at themselves, they were looking towards other Eurasian communities in India and Ceylon, which is quite significantly large. So India would be the Anglo-Indians, and Ceylon we have a lot of the Eurasians from Dutch descent. So all of them had their own papers, so the Eurasians felt, hey, we also should have one, to sort of like address some of the issues that we face. So you can see he said that the free press, comparing all the newspapers there, free press is acknowledged organ of the ruling race, which is the British. And then Straits Times occasionally give us a platform to air our public opinions, but then it never really championed our causes. And the Chinese had their own Chinese newspaper, the Lat Pao, and then the Jari Peranakan, the Malays had their Jari Peranakan newspaper. So this paper was set up to kind of openly discuss the issues that they were facing. So straight after that, it was succeeded by something with the same name, except the Eurasian was dropped from the title. And this is where the Nicholson comes in. Just now I mentioned Nicholson was mentioned in Makepeace, but so now he appears. So it was only probably in 1889 that he sort of took over the newspaper from Sept and started printing. So there isn't much change to the newspaper. He continued to champion issues that the Eurasian community faced, which is sort of the Khabar that shut them out from positions in civil service, in the government service, both civil and military, and also the kind of racial prejudices that they were facing despite being offspring of the Europeans. So they were treated like second-class citizens. So the newspaper was set up to try and address these issues. But unfortunately, it didn't last very long, though there were many people who subscribed, but apparently these people did not pay up. So the newspaper had to shut down. Yeah, so but was it successful then in addressing some of these issues? According to Makepeace's 100 Years, he said that the community felt that this newspaper did not sufficiently give voice to the Eurasian community as a whole. So, yeah. So next we have another group of people who are known to be very literate in English. There is the Straits Chinese. So this is actually one of the earliest, if not the first newspaper in Romanized Malay. And it's called the Straits Chinese Herald. It's quite a unique newspaper because it was bilingual. You can see the picture here. You have the English text on top and it's followed always by Malay translation below. So this happens for every article except for advertisements. It was published by someone called Alfred Wilfred Joseph Rosario. So as far as I can tell, he was a printer working for the government printing office in Sabah. But he was just purely a printer. The brains behind this whole enterprise is this person called Lim Yong Sing. Yeah, so there isn't much information about Lim Yong Sing, but I believe he was probably a member of the Presbyterian Church in Singapore, and we will see his name appearing again. So Lim Yong Sing's role was to translate these news into Malay, and then he had them published. So from this date, February, so not long after this office sort of merged with another newspaper. Yeah, and then the Straits Chinese Herald became a purely Malay newspaper. You don't have the English anymore. And then it stopped and it was absorbed. And then the Malay section moved into this other newspaper. So what did this Straits Chinese Herald try to do? Okay, Straits Chinese Herald is a bit different. It didn't seem to have some kind of political ambition or any cultural ambition. It simply wanted to provide information to people and to help people learn English. So it said to improve the knowledge of the Asiatics whose knowledge of English is defective. Okay, and then and it's to help these Straits Chinese whose English were not very good, to provide them in news in Malay so that they can read and know what and keep up with what is happening in the world that they live in. And thirdly, they thought this newspaper would be very good for the boys in schools, so they can improve in their studies, improve in their English, and as they read the newspaper, they will also grow up to become a scholar and a good boy, a better man. Yeah. So the fourth reason is they thought that this newspaper would be good for the Europeans to pick up Malay. And then, of course, it's only at the last that it says is to be a voice for all matters in which everybody was interested in. Okay, now we go to this daily advertiser that we're talking about, which this Straits Chinese Herald sort of merged with. So this daily advertiser has a very, very convoluted history. It changed hands many times, but it sort of kept up to a single image, which is that of an advertising newspaper. Yeah, so it's a cheap advertising newspaper, as it says. You can see the daily advertiser is a cheap advertising medium. Yeah, so it will be distributed free. And then you can see on the masthead, it says issued gratis, so all free. So I find some of the advertisements quite interesting, like the cigar one. Every man should smoke. Yeah, so it's advertising these cigars that were made in Manila. So this kind of advertising. So if you are into research for advertising, this kind of newspapers will yield quite some interesting things to look at. So this newspaper, though it was owned by Eurasian, established by one, it appears to be largely commercial. It's all about a platform for people to advertise. Yeah, so it was established by this person, Frois, I can't really pronounce his name, and he was the former foreman for the Straits Times Press. So he took over this mercantile press and started printing this daily advertiser. But I think you would see through the newspaper, it's quite interesting. Sometimes they couldn't find enough advertising, and then there will be a blank space. So it's a bit awkward. So eventually he had to charge people for the newspaper. Okay, now we go to this. So, back to here. They started in 1890, but 1894, a change took place. Someone actually bought the newspaper from him, and they retained the same title, Daily Advertiser. And still, you can see the red arrow. It says it's a cheapest advertising medium. Still branding itself as an advertising newspaper, but the content and its mission is very different. So in Jan 1894, Tan Teck Soon and Archibald Lamont from the Presbyterian Church, they actually bought this newspaper because the story goes was that Lamont was invited by Frost to contribute to the Daily Advertiser. And while contributing to the paper, he became very interested to have the paper as a platform to promote the work of the Anti-Opium League. So maybe I'll explain a little bit more about who are these two people. Lamont was a missionary to the China mission of the Presbyterian Church. And he was an advocate against opium trafficking and also the trafficking of women. So at that time, we know that opium was a very important revenue generator for the colonial government, making up, I think, almost up to half of the revenue. So Singapore was surviving on opium money to run its services. But with it came a lot of vices. So Tan Teck Soon, I think we will know him as the elder son of Tan Sibu. He's a very famous Chinese catechist, and he set up the Presbyterian Church. I think today we know it as a Glory Presbyterian Church also. Yeah. So, and he was also a very, he was an intellectual and one of the founding members of the Straits Philosophical Society. And he sort of had this idea that that Chinese civilization should progress and be open to change, while also challenging the prevailing Western idea that Chinese civilization was antiquated and unprogressive. So he was one of the first Straits Chinese to win a scholarship, to study and things like that. Yeah, so he was very much admirer of Chinese thought and society, but also critical of it. He admired it, but he was also critical of it, and he was also critical of Western imperialism. So anyway, these two people decided to buy over the newspaper and convert it for their users. And the translation was done by that Lim Yong Sing that I mentioned just now. But unfortunately, the newspaper closed down due to financial losses. They were sued for libel. So what were they sued for? Because they mentioned, they named someone by name in an article called The Social Cancer. And they talked about this person who sued them was called Lim Low. He was a building contractor and a man of means. So they reported in newspaper that he tried to purchase a girl from a brothel keeper when he already had 6 concubines in his home. So since they named him and he felt his reputation was being damaged, he sued them and he won the case. Yeah. So we can see the connection between what they were trying to do and then later on being sued for it. So this is the aim when it was under Lamont and Tan. These were the things they wanted to do. I'll just draw your attention to the last thing. It was to discuss important social and domestic questions such as opium habit and revenue, the spread of English education, the diffusion of more beneficial ideas of Western civilization among the rapidly increasing English-speaking Asiatic population. So after they closed down, what happened? The newspaper went back to the original person, which was John Murray Frost, and he renamed it called the Mid-Day Herald. But you can see again, it's still cheapest medium, advertising medium. It hasn't changed. It's still advertising newspaper. So we go on to the next one. And then come 1896, it's still Frost, but he renamed the newspaper again, calling it the Mid-Day Herald and Daily Advertiser. And he had a new editor, and he also changed the name of his publishing firm. But again, the marketing is all about advertising. And then we have eventually, apparently he sort of suffered for not having good editorial staff. He was given a copy of the governor's speech that the governor had intended to present later, but he sort of forgot, like he didn't keep track of the embargo, and he published it before the governor gave the speech. So this led to a lot of public ridicule, like people were saying, his newspaper is kind of like no standard. Yeah. So in the end, he sold this newspaper to another Eurasian, Samuel Willard Augustine, and this person renamed the newspaper. Again, no change. It's still marketed as an advertising newspaper. So all in all, these newspapers, though they were owned, and the variation, the different variation in the name, they were owned by Eurasian and for a short time by the Straits Chinese and Lamont, the Presbyterian Church. It doesn't appear to be any platform to voice the concerns of the Eurasian community. Now we go on to a very different community, the Indian-owned English Daily. Why did they set up this newspaper? So this Mona Ragasamy, sorry, I have problems pronouncing some of his name. He was the owner of a Caxton Printing Works and also a Tamil weekly newspaper. So he decided to set up this Eastern Daily Mail because there was no morning paper at that time. You might be saying, what happened to the Straits Times? Yeah, today we know Straits Times as a morning paper, but at that time in 1905, Straits Times was an afternoon newspaper. So there was no morning newspaper, and the Eastern Daily Mail came in to fill in that gap. So this newspaper did very well. In fact, they sold for 5 cents. Remember just now we had like 25 cents, we had 15 cents, and then now it's down to 5 cents. And the circulation was about 1,500 to 200 copies, which is a lot, because just now we saw the circulations are only 200, 150. So the early editors were actually Europeans, but there was a lot of changes in the company, and it didn't do that well until they hired this journalist from Bombay, a Parsi journalist called Sarabi Kavashi. Okay, you can see a picture of him here. So he was a very, very multi-talented person. He was fluent in Gujarati, English, Persian, Urdu, and he began his career with translating English works into these languages like Gujarati. And then later on, he went to work for the first daily evening paper in Bombay called Rupon Reporter. After that, he decided not to do work in journalism. He went to study veterinary science, and he actually worked as a vet, and he won many scholarships. But eventually, he returned back to journalism in 1899, and he became an editor for a Gujarati daily paper. And then in 1905, he decided to come to Singapore and joined the Eastern Daily Mail as its editor. So in 1906, Rajasamy decided to sell his printing press to Straits Press Syndicate, which was owned by a person called Pona Subramaniam. He's a resident of KL. And then Subramaniam basically made Kavaji the sole manager and editor. But unfortunately, again, just like some of the newspapers before, it had to close down because it was being sued. So what did this Eastern Daily Mail try to do? It said it would be rigidly independent and cosmopolitan. It will keep to the motto of justice, equality, peace, and progress, keep people updated with what's happening. And actually, they were modeling towards the Daily Mail. Okay, today we know the Daily Mail in London as a tabloid news, but I guess in that day when the Daily Mail came out, it was a very different kind of paper because it was a newspaper read by the masses in Great Britain. So this was what they wanted to do. They wanted to be like the Daily Mail and not to have, a newspaper that's only appealing to the higher class of people. So this notice you see on the slide is of the transfer of the ownership of Caxton Printing Press. Okay, now we come back to the Straits Chinese again. Okay, in case you are lost, I've done through so many newspapers, is that I've arranged it chronologically so that we can see some of the developments over time. So this is another English newspaper, and it was published by the Union Times. And the proprietor of this newspaper is Bui Chuan Po. So I don't have a picture of him. So on the slide, you can see here is a gravestone of him at Bukit Brown. So this time, this Weekly Sun is different from the Straits Chinese Herald. Just now, Straits Chinese Herald was set up to help the Straits Chinese learn English. And for those who were only literate in Malay, they could catch up with the news. And also for the British people to learn, or English people to learn Malay through the newspaper. But the Weekly Sun was meant to promote the interests of the Straits Chinese. So it's a bit different. And we know that Union Press, this Chinese newspaper, was a pro-loyalist paper. Yeah, though it began as a revolutionary paper. Basically, it's a reformist paper. Yeah. So Bui Chuan Po was the proprietary of this Chinese newspaper. But interestingly, one thing about him is that his home, Bin Chan House, is his villa, which he sold off, is today's the Sun Yat-sen Villa. So he was a reformist, but eventually after he sold it, how it changed hands, and then it became like the headquarters for Sun Yat-sen as the Tong Min Hui base in Singapore. So that is some historical connection. So he sold it for 5 cents, and then he had to increase it to 10 cents, and then eventually it ended and it went into receivership. So I think again financially it's very tough to run a newspaper at that time. So what was the objective of the paper? It was, he says, the Chinese community or the colony are worthy subjects of the king. Their patriotism is unquestionable. Their business instincts are far famed. So it's the desire to foster this friendship between the Straits Chinese and the establishment. So Yeah, so it's also for the Straits Chinese to communicate their ideas and to improve the relationship. Now I'm going on. Is to me what I feel is the most successful and important newspaper that was established by the Anglophone agents, which is the Malaya Tribune. So it's the first English paper sponsored by various nationalities in Singapore. Previously, what we saw were ethnic-based newspapers, Eurasian or Straits Chinese. But this was one which was collectively done by various communities, Asian communities in Singapore. So it was a kind of a pan-Asian or pan-Malayan newspaper, and less of an ethnic base. So it was printed and published by the Straits Eurasian Press. This press already existed in 1907 as a printer, stationer, and then later on, because the newspaper took off, they just renamed the printing company to Malaya Tribune Press. So it was set up to express the views and styles of the domiciled communities, which are the agents here, and to cater to all the English-speaking population in Malaya, not only in Singapore. So that's why some of the early names they considered having was Voice of Malaya, the voice of the people. But Malaya Tribune wasn't the first to do that. Actually, a Penang paper called the Straits Echo first started with this idea of having a people's paper, and Malaya Tribune is kind of like inspired by what was happening in Penang, and then they decided to start one. Okay, so who were the board of directors? So they have a very long history, and so I will only concentrate on the original board of directors, the first board of directors. I don't have pictures for the three people below, but I'll try to explain, share a bit more about who they are. We have on the left, George E. Bogas. I put the word senior because people is commonly confused with his son, who has the same name. And in the newspapers, they don't put senior or junior. So sometimes it's a bit confusing who they're referring to. And then Alexander Westerhout is also Eurasian. So we have Bogas and Westerhout, who are Eurasians. And then we have Lim Boon Keng. I think he needs a little mention. But maybe I'll go back to Bogas, okay, to explain. He was actually a Eurasian of Dutch descent. He was born in Ceylon. Just now we talked about Ceylon having a sizable Dutch Eurasian community. So he was born in Ceylon in 1868, and that's where he learned printing. And he sort of rose through the ranks and worked through and finally became a manager for the Elborn printing press. So you can see he used that same name when he came to Singapore and set up his own business. When he first came to Singapore, he worked for a printing press called Ribeiro. Those who collect historical postcards will find this name quite familiar. Then after that, he decided to set up his own printing press called the Straits Eurasian Press with two friends. And after these two friends left, they sold their interest to this Alex Westerhout. Okay, and from here, they decided to have this newspaper called the Malaya Tribune. Okay, so Bogas is a very important person because he basically steered the newspaper through its most difficult times. When the newspaper was published in 1914, this was the year where World War I took place. And after that, they had a lot of difficulties with supplies and stuff like that. But at the same time, it was a mixed blessing because the demand for news also increased and skyrocketed. So it was like a mixed blessing of sorts. So Bogas was his managing editor. Yeah, he was his manager all the way up to his retirement in 1933. Then he finally died in 1941. So Westerhout, he was a managing director, but he left in 1916 because he felt there wasn't much prospects, I think, here in Malaya, and he decided to leave with his family for America. And then Bogas became the managing director instead. Then, of course, Lim Boon Keng, he was the first chairman. So Bogas and Westerhout did all the managing and all the printing, but the finances and the capital to start such an expensive venture came from the Straits Chinese, of which Lim Boon Keng was very important and very influential in soliciting funds to run this newspaper. So I think Lim Boon Keng needs little introduction, so I won't go too much into his life. So, and then there's Koh San Him. He was a Straits Chinese, and a very well-known rubber planter. And he was the president of the Straits Chinese British Association. So his tombstone is also at Bukit Brown. Then we have M.V. Pillai. He was a prominent Indian lawyer and president of the Ceylon Tamil Association. And then Anguilla was an Indian Muslim or an Indian Malay Muslim by ethnicity. He was a doctor and a member of the REM board. After that, there were a lot of very famous people who became directors of this company also. So they always had this idea that they wanted to start a newspaper. So it was discussed by several people, but then everybody felt it was such a risky venture, so it never took off. So there are actually two accounts, but I think the official account from the Malaya Tribune was that Bogas wanted to start this newspaper, and then Western Hub sort of encouraged him, and then later on they wrote in Dr. Lim Boon Keng to help with the finances. And in their inaugural meeting, these were some of the things that they set out to do, basically to promote, to give voice to the Asiatic people, and perhaps the newspapers of those days were not giving them, not defending their rights, or they didn't give them a platform to air these views. So I'll just move on. So the newspapers, its objective say is a meeting place for all nationalities, because Lim Boon Keng also said in his Jubilee, right, that it was very difficult for the Asians and the Eurasians to be fairly represented. So they had to have a newspaper that was devoted to the interests of the entire community. But I thought what was interesting was they also had a policy that all the profits that they earned did not go back to the directors. They had to be reinvested back to the company to strengthen the newspaper. Yeah, so maybe that's why the newspaper was able to survive very long. So it wasn't until 1922 that a nominal fee was introduced as a director's fee. So some of the issues they tackled was like the conditions of workers, education, and then again, lifting of the colour bar in government and municipal services. So you can see this is how the office looked like, and they started printing at Collyer Quay, their first plant, which was a storage place for coconut oil. So they took up the second and third floor and converted it into a printing plant. And then they had multiple versions. You can see there's a Malay, a Tamil, a Sunday, a KL version, a Ipoh version, a morning version, and also a Penang version. So to meet all these versions and give updated news, they actually set up printing presses also in KL, Ipoh, and Penang. So yeah, because before that, they had to print in Singapore the night before and then sent it up country the next morning. Yeah, then the Malay Tribune also acquired this illustrated newspaper and then later on absorbed it. Okay, so one thing about the Malay Tribune is very proud that it managed to sell the newspaper at 5 cents because they wanted the paper to be very affordable. So for a long time, they sold it at 5 cents. They only increased it to 10 cents before World War II. So they did so well that they eventually, Straits Times was forced to also sell the newspaper at 5 cents. So I have some circulation figures there. You can take a look. And what they tried to do was modern style presenting, eye-catching headlines, more pictures, and they had coverage of local news and sports. They had a direct telephone line from the horse racing, so you can get all your racing, betting, results. And then it was also the first newspaper to feature color advertising on its first page. But perhaps the downfall came during the Japanese occupation, where its offices were all ransacked. So the machines and everything was... Yeah, only the KL and Ipoh one managed to sort of still retain some semblance because the Japanese were using it to print their own papers, but the Singapore one and the Penang one was in very bad state. So after the war, what happened is that it continued again to be a paper for the people, and for a long time it was managed by this very, very capable person, Maurice Glover, and he was a member of the Jewish community. He was one who came up with the idea that we should have printing plants in Ipoh, KL, so that we could supply the papers fast and we could provide up-to-date newspapers. So it took on a kind of a political stance. It was to help Malaya achieve self-government and political unification, and also to treat the different Asian communities, everybody fairly, and also to provide good working conditions for the labourer. So they said that we will also have to walk the talk So the paper was always Asian-owned. The directors were always Asians, but the editors were mostly Europeans, but increasingly they tried to get the Asian staff to fill up these senior positions. And so you can see the figure actually reduced, the number of Europeans. Then by 1951, it had to kind of close down because of rising competition. And I mentioned about World War II, the effects of World War II. Okay, now I move on to Japanese newspapers. Okay, this is very interesting. Japanese-owned newspaper, I would call it probably a propaganda paper, was published by Shohei Nagao in 1939. So he was also the proprietor of the Singapore Nippo, which is a Japanese newspaper that was circulated in Indonesia, Malaya for the Japanese residents. And then I think the context is that the anti-Japanese sentiments were very high because of the Second Sino-Japanese War that was taking place in China, and Japan's rising militarism was a cause of concern for the British. So this led to some kind of propaganda battle between Japan and Britain. So this Nagao decided to set up an English and Chinese edition of the Singapore Nippo. And then eventually the English edition also became the Singapore Herald. Okay, when the papers came out, Straits Times and Free Press were wrote a lot of editorials about it and saying that it was backed by the Japanese government and that it was pro-Japanese and anti-British propaganda paper because they sold the newspaper at 3 cents. So we all know that newspaper was selling at 5 cents. So imagine you can sell at 3 cents, you can't kind of undercut your competitors. So it was quite a large circulation, 5,000 copies being printed. But then the Singapore Herald refuted, say that, no, we just aim to present the newspapers concisely, and our wire sources come from American and British sources and stuff like that. But eventually the newspaper closed down because they were rounded up. The editors were rounded up by the British authorities, and then they were sent over to internment camps in India. So let's take a look. Singapore Herald, what did it aim to do? This isn't published on the newspaper itself, but on the Singapore Nippo, which was the daily. So it said that it tried to sort of like promote a Malayan cause, and there was a need for a new world outlook, and which means the Pan-Asian, the Greater East Asia prosperity sphere, that kind of world outlook, and then to foster a kind of encouragement, a new spirit of brotherhood and cosmopolitan, because they were very much anti-imperialism. Okay, the Singapore Nippo is a bit different from the Singapore Herald because Singapore Nippo, what it tried to do was to praise. It had these frequent reports where it praised the Japanese administration in the occupied areas of China, saying that, and in the Chinese edition, it was sort of open propaganda. It tried to win the sympathy of these overseas Chinese by advocating peace and cooperation between the Chinese and the Japanese. Yeah, but the Singapore Herald was a bit different in its treatment of news. It tried to win over the overseas Chinese, but it also tried to be an influence. It tried to influence opinion among the English-speaking classes in favor of Japan. And the format and style it followed was the American way of journalism, American news. So where did this influence of this American news came from? So I'd like to introduce these two people. You can read out about them on the internet. They're kind of well researched on. First is William. Actually, he's usually known as Bill Kosokawa. He was the first editor of the Singapore Herald. So, and this other person, which I find very, very interesting, this Tatsuki Fuji or John Fuji. I will spend more time on the second person because I think he's a very fascinating, controversial figure who's kind of like, I don't know, a person of ambiguity. So anyway, this William Hosokawa, these two are considered as Nisei, which is like a second generation Japanese Americans. So Hosokawa is actually born in Seattle, and he graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in journalism. So when he graduated, his basically his supervisor told him, say that nobody's going to hire a Japanese boy to be a reporter in an American newspaper. So it turned out to be true. So he had to work as a secretary in the Japanese consulate in Seattle. because he couldn't find any newspaper publisher who would hire Japanese. So this Seattle consul was later appointed as the consul general in Singapore. And probably through this kind of like connection of news and flow of news, he heard about this job opening in Singapore that this Shohei Nagao wanted to set up an English newspaper in Singapore, and that he wanted someone who had American newspaper training. So William Hosokawa sort of came to Singapore, and he was the first editor. So under him, the newspaper was, of course, pro-Japanese, and supported Japan's position in international news, and was very critical of the nationalist government in China, the Kuomintang. Then with the rising tensions in Singapore, I think you heard of the Chinese were boycotting Japanese goods, and even their own Chinese staff in the Singapore Herald were beaten up by Chinese gangs. So he left in 1940 to work in Shanghai. Then eventually the relationship between Japan and United States became so bad, he had to return back to the United States. And there, I think you all have heard and also seen movies, the Japanese Americans were actually interned in concentration camps in America. Yeah, so it's a very sad part of their history. And he became the editor of the internship camp newspaper. But maybe perhaps there's a light at the end of the story, is that he became a very respected journalist after that, and a civil rights leader, and even a diplomat. So he's a very well-respected figure. And now I come to this Tatsuji Fuji, and you can see he actually wrote this book called Singapore Assignment, and I encourage anybody who has the time, interest to read it. It's a very fascinating read. And there's a picture, a drawing of him, and you can see probably Southbridge Road. So he's a person of contradiction, I say. Some people call him a spy. Some people say he was an agent, and some people more sympathetic say he was just a victim of circumstances. So he was described as being always very smartly dressed, and he had a lot of money, and he would be seen at all these boxing and baseball matches and cabarets with lady friends and giving sumptuous dinner. So this Fuji, he's second generation, but a little bit different. He was born in Japan, unlike Hosokawa. And then later on, as an infant, he was brought to California, but he was actually denied citizenship, American citizenship. So he began his career working for these Japanese newspapers in the United States. And then in 1938, he joined the New York bureau at Asahi Shimbun. And there he was recruited by a Japanese consular to join the Singapore Herald. So he joined Singapore Herald, and he was the assistant to William Hosokawa. You see on top, Bill Hosokawa. And then later on, when Hosokawa left to Shanghai, he became the editor. So under him, the newspaper became even more critical of the British colonial imperialism. He saw it as exploitation of the Malays, of the Chinese, And he was very, very scathing of all the newspapers in Singapore, the Malaya Tribune, Singapore, Straits Times, Singapore Free Press, and stuff like that. So you can read all about it. Eventually, like I said, they were rounded up by the British and jailed. Then he was sent to internment camp in India. Then there he was a liaison for the British and the Japanese. Then he was repatriated back to Japan. But then he came back to Singapore again in 1942. And for a year, he worked for the Domain News Agency, which is the Japan official news agency. And then in December 1942, then he became the editor for the Shonan Times, or Shonan Shimbun, as you know it. Yeah. Okay, he didn't stay all the time in Singapore. Later, he also went to Burma, Rangoon. And then when the British took back Singapore, he was actually flown in by the Japanese just to attend the surrender ceremony. Yeah. And the thing was that he was never tried for any war crimes. And he was allowed to move around freely and even worked as an interpreter for the Australian Imperial Forces. That's why you see the sensational headline, Johnny Fuji free in Singapore, self-professed Axis agent. So basically he wrote this memoir, which I think you can read. It was first published in the Nippon Times and then collated into this book. So he recounted his pre-war impressions of Singapore. Like I talk about the exploitation, and he called the Tribune a cheap, sensational newspaper. It was a Chinese propaganda tool, financed with Chinese and Jewish capital and money, Interestingly, I thought he said that his time in Singapore was where he learned the Japanese way and the Japanese philosophy and the mission of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And he witnessed Singapore when it was under the Japanese rule, and he actually said that he thinks that the lives of the residents actually improved. The lives were better than the time they lived under British times. Yeah, so you can tell he has very different views. So just now, like I said, the Singapore Herald said that, oh no, we are just here to be a voice for the Malayan people, and we honor and want to desire to have a good friendship, Anglo-Japanese friendship, to maintain this good relationship. But actually, what was the real purpose for setting up this newspaper? So I think he himself said in his book, British interests were firmly entrenched in the Straits Times and the Free Press. And the Singapore Herald saw it's a golden opportunity to push out the Malaya Tribune with its Chinese propaganda of the streets. And that's why this newspaper was founded. Okay, so now we go after war, we have this newspaper, Indian. I try to class them, the purple and red for the Straits Chinese, We have this newspaper, very interesting one to me. Sarapagi, sorry, I can't really pronounce the name. He was the editor of the Tamil Marasu, and he decided to set up an English newspaper. So this was actually a spin-off. The Tamil Marasu actually had an English news page, and then it was spin-off into this full daily newspaper, and it sold at 2 cents. So why did he set up newspaper in 1940? Because he said that the stress of this World War II, people were minimizing the kind of space to feature Indian news. So he felt there was a need to have to feature Indian news to find out what's happening. There was a demand for it. So he decided to set up this newspaper, and that they don't hold any affiliation. The affiliations to Mother India, and no caste, but no creed, but universal brotherhood. So you can see he had this, he's a very well-respected Tamil writer and publisher and leader. He arrived in Singapore from Tamil Nadu in 1924. He's bilingual in Tamil and English. Then he was very much inspired by the self-respect movement in Tamil Nadu, which talked about rationalism, the idea of a modern progressive society, and he founded the Tamil Reform Association. So you can see his newspaper, his vision is all about reforming the Indian community and the caste system. And so he also do it through this newspaper. The picture of him here, and next to him is actually his wife. He's a Chinese Peranakan. So anyway, it's not strange at the time for people to see India as motherland and for Chinese people to see China as motherland or fatherland. But this changed after the war. So you can see after the war, the Indian Daily Mail, it changed its editorial direction, that it hoped to be a strong and vocal public voice for Malaya. And so it was no longer a newspaper promoting like featuring Indian news or a reformist paper for the Indian community, but it was meant to be a newspaper for all the communities, because you can see at the beginning he said that the World War II and the Japanese occupation was a transformational experience, that that this kind of oppression will lead to everybody coming together and say we need self-reliance and self-government. So, but then the paper ran for a long time, but eventually closing in 1956. I find it interesting because this was probably the only newspaper I knew that willingly sort of like closed down, not because of financial difficulties, not because they were sued, but because they felt that they have already accomplished their mission and hence they were closing down. So I think it's kind of noteworthy, and to quote it at length, because probably will give us some insight as to why these ethnic-based newspapers have sort of declined. So it says the duty of every community to contribute, and through their newspaper, they have done it. To the achievement of Merdeka, they have done it for the Indian community. Now on the eve of Merdeka, a Merdeka era, we consider our task has been accomplished, so we will withdraw. So I like what they say in the third and fourth paragraph. The achievement of Merdeka, communal politics must end in this country. and the various communities must adopt a Malayan spirit, a Malayan outlook, and help in the formation of a single nation, without which Merdeka will have no meaning. So the various communities can and must cherish their respective linguistic and cultural heritage and traditions, and maintain these in their own newspapers and their own languages. But politically, we cannot function as separate communal entities. Hence, this newspaper has already outlived its purpose and usefulness with the achievement of Merdeka. So this newspaper was already set up as a political organ, right, for the Indian community, has already outlived its purpose because now there is a new Malayan nation. Okay, now I'll come to the last newspaper. We have reached to the last one. Again, another pan-Malayan newspaper, the Tiger Standard, which will of course remind you of the Tiger Bar King. Yes, so you can see the masthead, there's a tiger there, and it was meant to be a voice of Malaya. So it was an English newspaper published by Singapore Amalgamated Limited. And this is not the only newspaper that they publish. So of course you know about the Tiger Balm family, so I won't go too much into that. But he started off in Yangon with 2 newspapers, but it wasn't that successful. And he only found success when he started the Sinju Jitpo, Sinzhou Repao in Singapore. And after that, he became known as a press magnate. He published a lot of newspapers, 13 as far as I know. And he was governing director of this Simpo Amalgamated Limited. So they publish newspapers in China, Amoy, Swatao, and Hong Kong, which is the Hong Kong Tiger Standard. It's still surviving today as the standard. Don't have the tiger or Hong Kong on it. And Southeast Asia, it set up newspaper in Bangkok, and I think also in Sarawak. Yeah, set up newspaper in Sarawak. So this Singapore Tiger Standard was the second English daily after the Hong Kong Tiger Standard. So it's a 13 in this chain. And his first editor was this Chang Kui Xuan, was a very popular sports writer who rose through the rank. He was born in Shanghai and educated in Baptist University in Shanghai that was run by missionaries. So he rose through the ranks writing for the China Press, which was an American established newspaper. And then during the Japanese occupation, he sort of didn't work and still sort of stayed with the newspaper, though the newspaper wasn't publishing at the time. When it reopened, he rejoined the newspaper. Eventually, when the communists sort of took over China, he decided to leave and take a job in Hong Kong to work for this Hong Kong Standard, this Hong Kong Tiger Standard. And then he was told to come to Singapore to start this Singapore Tiger Standard. So that's how he ended up here. Yeah. So, yeah. So by this time, we know that there are several competitors, right? There was still the Malaya Tribune, the Singapore Tiger Standard, and then we have the Straits Times, and then the Free Press. So the Malaya Tribune sort of died off, right? And then Straits Times' main competitor then was the Singapore Standard. But when the Singapore Standard finally closed, Straits Times didn't really have a very big contender. There were still other newspapers being published, competing with the Straits one, but these were the major ones. The Malaya Tribune and the Singapore Tiger Standards were the main ones that, and even the Singapore Herald for a time, because they said they were distributing newspapers and even selling it to these British soldiers. These newsboys would enter into the garrisons and sell these newspapers. Yeah, so it became a real scandal for the British. So this Singapore Standard finally abruptly ended. You can see this announcement. So the staff also didn't know, and they were taken by surprise. 400 over stars. So that's it. Yeah, I don't actually know why they ended. But then we know that Ao Boon Hao had passed away already in 1954. So maybe there are some changes in the family business. So this is their policy and creed. I will just let you read through it. So it's the same idea again of a democratic, prosperous Malaya, is to be a voice for Malaya, a vehicle of public opinion for the people, and it's to be the forefront of the struggle for nationhood, and they try to be fair. Yeah, so this is it. Okay, so now I finished the main part and just 2-3 short slides. Just happy to announce some of these new newspapers that we have in our collection. These are the physical ones. Especially excited about the first two on the left, Bintang Timur, donated by Mr. John Koh, and Rising Sun, which is a Japanese occupation paper. Because these papers, they were not recorded before. Like, we may know of their existence because someone mentioned it, but they are not there's no physical copy that was recorded as having existed. So through donation, and this one is through combing our legal deposit collection, we found these extra newspapers that you see here. So, and then this is our new digitized content. First three are actually the Straits Chinese newspaper. Like I said, the Straits Chinese mainly published and put out Malay newspapers. English newspapers it's much lesser. I think it's those two that I've shown. And then we have a lot of the SPH newspapers that are now online that you can use. And then lastly, I also want to share, not only us, you can also visit the NUS Digital Gems website. They also put up some of these papers. Some are the same titles that we have, but they also have some newspapers that we don't have, like the Singapore Nippo, the one that I mentioned, the Sohei Nagao's Singapore Nippo, the daily, Japanese daily, before he sort of made it into a weekly. So with that, I've actually come to the end. Thanks for your patience.